Seraphine heard him say it from across the banquet hall. She had not meant to listen. She had been standing against the far wall with a tray of tincture bottles, brought along as Mistress Isolde's assistant in case the elderly lords needed attending. She was trying to be invisible, the way she had spent her entire life trying to be invisible. No one else paid attention to the foundling herbalist pressed against the stone. But Seraphine paid attention to everything, because paying attention to Caspian Darovic was the only currency she had ever been allowed to trade in. She stood motionless with the tray balanced in her trembling hands, and she listened to Lord Hargreave ask the question that would gut her. "Your Majesty, the court is curious. Your bonding ceremony with the Thornwood girl is only a month away, and yet you keep the foundling close. People talk." There was a pause. Seraphine pressed her back against the cold stone, her pulse hammering so loudly she was certain the guards could hear it. Then Caspian laughed. It was a warm sound, easy, the laugh of a man who had never once questioned his place in the world. "Seraphine?" he said, and the casualness with which he spoke her name sent a crack through something vital in her chest. "She is only convenient, Hargreave. Surely you have noticed. The girl has a calming effect. My physicians confirmed it months ago. She helps me sleep. Nothing more. And the bonding with Lady Auriel? Proceeds as planned. The Thornwood Alliance secures our northern border. Seraphine understands her role." The tray shook in her hands. Glass clinked against glass, and she gripped the edges until her knuckles went white. She set it down on the nearest surface because she could no longer trust her grip, and she pressed her trembling fingers against her sternum where the bond lived. She could feel him through it. Even now, even after what he had just said, she could feel the low, steady hum of his presence like a second heartbeat lodged beneath her ribs. It had been there for months now, growing warmer, growing louder, growing into something she had been foolish enough to mistake for love. Convenient. The word burrowed into her like a splinter driven beneath the nail. She had slept beside him for 5 months. She had held his hand through the nightmares that no one else knew about. She had listened to him speak about his dead mother in the dark, his voice cracking on syllables he would never let crack in daylight. She had given him every vulnerable, unguarded piece of herself, and he had smiled at a lord over wine and called her convenient. Seraphine straightened her spine. She smoothed her expression into something blank and serviceable, the face of a woman who understood her role, and she walked away from the pillar without looking back. She did not bring him the water. That night, she packed a single bag. She folded her 2 dresses, her herb pouch, the comb Mistress Isolde had given her when she turned 16, and the small leather journal she used to record tincture recipes. She did not pack the silk robe that had appeared on her chair 3 months ago, unmarked, without explanation, in exactly the shade of green that matched her eyes. She left it folded on the bed. She left her door open. She walked through the eastern corridor and down the servants' stair, past the kitchens where the bread ovens still radiated warmth from the evening bake, past the laundry where sheets hung like pale ghosts in the dark, past the postern gate where old Morin the night guard sat dozing over his crossbow. He opened one eye as she approached. "Late for a walk, little bird." "I am leaving, Marin." Both eyes opened then. He studied her face, and whatever he saw there made him sigh heavily through his nose. He reached for the bolt. "Mind the frost on the bridge. It is slick this time of year." The night air hit her face like an open hand, cold, sharp, and clarifying. She crossed the bridge over the Ashenmere, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and she did not look back at the castle that had been the only home she had ever known. At the tree line, a figure waited. Tall, broad-shouldered, leaning against an oak with his arms crossed and his head tilted at an angle that suggested he had been there for some time. Fennec Ashgrove, alpha of the Grey Mist Pack and Caspian's most vocal political rival, straightened when he saw her. "You actually came," he said. There was no triumph in his voice, no smugness, Just a quiet, steady surprise, like he had offered an open door without expecting anyone to walk through it. "You said if I ever needed to leave, you would help me," Seraphine replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am leaving." Fennec studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, shrugged off his coat, and draped it over her shoulders without asking permission. "Then we go," he said. Behind them, the castle was dark and silent. By morning, the Alpha King of Valethorn would wake alone for the first time in 5 months and discover that the woman he had called convenient was gone. And with her, the only peace he had ever known. But that is getting ahead of the story. Let us go back to the beginning, to the night Seraphine first walked into the Alpha King's chamber and changed everything. 6 months earlier, Seraphine had been on her hands and knees in the still room, grinding valerian root into paste, when Mistress Isolde appeared in the doorway and told her to wash her face and report to the king's wing immediately. "What have I done?" Seraphine asked, because a summons to the king's wing never meant anything good for a foundling herbalist with no family name and no standing. "Nothing, child, just go, and do not speak unless spoken to." The walk from the healer's quarters to the royal wing took 7 minutes on a good day. That evening it took Seraphine 12 because her legs had forgotten how to move at a normal pace. The corridors grew wider and better lit as she climbed, the rough-hewn stone giving way to polished marble, the tallow candles replaced by oil lamps that cast a warm, honeyed glow across portraits of kings she had never been important enough to learn the names of. A guard she did not recognize opened a carved door without a word and gestured her inside. The room was a private study, smaller than she had expected. A fire burned in the hearth. Maps covered every surface, and in the center of it all, seated behind a desk buried in correspondence, was Corvin Thanavale, the king's beta and most trusted advisor. He looked up when she entered. His eyes were sharp, assessing, the gaze of a man who catalogued people the way others catalogued inventory. "You are the herbalist," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lord." "The one who was present in the council chamber 3 days ago when His Majesty experienced an episode." Seraphine's stomach clenched. 3 days ago. The council meeting she had been summoned to because Lord Edric's gout had flared, and someone needed to apply the compress while the meeting continued. She had knelt beside the old lord's swollen foot, working quietly, trying to be invisible, when she had noticed the king's breathing change. She had looked up and found his eyes closed. His head had tipped forward, his chin nearly touching his chest, and for 11 seconds, the Alpha King of Valethorn had been asleep in front of his entire council. Then he had jerked awake, his hand slamming flat against the table, and the meeting had resumed as though nothing had happened. No one had spoken of it, but everyone had seen it. "I was there," Seraphine confirmed carefully. "But I did not do anything, my lord. I was only tending to Lord Edric." Corvin studied her in silence for an uncomfortable stretch. Then he said, "What I am about to tell you does not leave this room. If it does, there will be consequences. Am I understood?" "Yes, my lord." "The king has not slept in over 14 months. Seraphine blinked. "That is not possible." "And yet," Corvin replied, his voice flat, "we have exhausted every remedy, every healer, every herb in the kingdom. Nothing works. His wolf keeps him alive, but his body is deteriorating. At the current rate, the royal physicians give him 8 months." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. 3 days ago, after more than a year of nothing, he fell asleep. For 11 seconds. You were in the room. Seraphine shook her head. "That could be coincidence, my lord." "It could," Corvin agreed, "which is why we intend to test it. Tomorrow, I will arrange for you to be present during a private briefing in the king's study. You will sit in the corner. You will not speak. You will not draw attention to yourself. And we will observe what happens." Does the king know about this? Seraphine asked. The king knows he is dying, Corvin said quietly. He has accepted it with the same stubborn resignation he applies to everything. So no, he does not know about this test, because if he did, he would refuse it out of spite. A chill ran through her. She wanted to argue, to explain that she was nobody, that she had no special ability, that this was all a terrible mistake. But Corvin's expression left no room for argument. Tomorrow morning, he repeated. Be here at dawn. She barely slept that night. At dawn she reported to the study, her palms damp, her heart thudding, and was shown to a chair in the far corner behind a screen. The king arrived 20 minutes later with 2 advisors. Seraphine heard his voice before she saw him, low and controlled, and edged with the kind of weariness that goes bone deep. Through a gap in the screen, she watched him work. He read reports. He issued orders. He listened to his advisors with the focused patience of a man who had trained himself to function on fumes. 40 minutes passed. Seraphine counted every one of them. Then she saw his pen slow. His head dipped forward, just slightly. He caught himself, pressed the heel of his hand against his eye, and continued writing. 2 minutes later, his shoulders dropped. His pen stilled. His eyes closed, and his head came to rest against the high back of his chair. He was asleep. The advisors froze. One turned toward the screen where Corvin stood watching. The beta raised his hand. Wait. 53 minutes. The Alpha King of Valethorn slept for 53 minutes in a hard-backed chair while a foundling herbalist sat behind a screen and tried not to breathe too loudly. When he woke, Seraphine was already being escorted out through a side door. She made it halfway down the corridor before Corvin caught her. This evening, he said, his voice low and urgent, His Majesty's private chambers, you will sleep there tonight. Seraphine stopped walking. I beg your pardon? A chair in his study is not sustainable. We need proximity through the night, full sleep cycles. A pallet will be set up for you. In the king's bedroom, Seraphine said flatly. Adjacent to it. And if he objects? Corvin's expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy, or might have been a warning. He will not know you are there, not initially. Seraphine stared at him. You want me to sleep in the king's chambers without his knowledge? I want the king to live, Corvin replied. Do you not? She had no answer to that. Or rather, she had an answer that frightened her, because it came too quickly and burned too fiercely for a woman who had spent her entire life being no one to no one. This evening, Corvin repeated, and he walked away before she could argue. The king's chambers smelled like cedar and iron and something underneath that Seraphine could not name. Something warm and alive that wrapped around her lungs and made her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She had been installed in a narrow alcove off the main bedroom, separated by a heavy curtain. Her pallet was thin. Her blanket was borrowed. The pillow was an improvement over the one in her quarters, which was not saying much. Through the curtain, she could hear the fire crackling in the hearth and the low murmur of Caspian speaking with Corvin. She pressed her face into the pillow and willed her heartbeat to slow. The murmuring stopped. A door closed. Footsteps crossed the room, heavy and deliberate, and she heard the creak of the bed frame taking his weight. Then silence. Seraphine lay rigid in the dark, counting her breaths. She was acutely aware that 15 feet of stone floor and a curtain were the only things separating her from the most powerful man in the kingdom. A man who did not know she was here. A man whose breathing she could hear with terrible clarity, each exhale rough and uneven, the sound of a body fighting itself. An hour passed. She could hear him shifting, turning, the sheets rustling with the restless movements of a man whose body screamed for sleep, while something inside him refused to surrender. It went on and on, a private, excruciating battle that no one was supposed to witness. Then, gradually, his breathing changed. It deepened, The restless shifting stopped. Seraphine held her own breath, listening. Silence. Deep, steady, complete silence except for the slow rhythm of his breathing, and it was the most peaceful sound she had ever heard. He slept for 4 hours and 16 minutes. Seraphine knew because she counted every one of them, lying awake in her alcove, listening to him breathe, like it was her responsibility to keep watch over this fragile, impossible thing. He woke once, a sharp intake of breath, a muttered word she could not make out, and then the rustling resumed. But within minutes, his breathing steadied again, and he sank back under. When pale light crept around the edges of the curtain, Seraphine rose silently, folded her blanket, and slipped out through the servants' passage before he stirred. She was back in the still room grinding chamomile before the palace woke. Corvin found her at midday. 4 hours. The word carried more weight than she had ever heard a single number hold. He has not slept 4 consecutive hours since the war ended. He paused. It is you. It might be the alcove, Seraphine tried. A change of environment, perhaps. We moved him to 6 different rooms over the past year, 3 different castles. He slept in a tent in the northern mountains for a week. Nothing. Corvin's gaze was steady. It is you, Seraphine. She did not know what to do with that information. She did not know how to be the reason a king could sleep, when she had spent her whole life being the reason for nothing at all. The arrangement continued. Night after night, she crept into the alcove after the palace settled and lay behind the curtain, listening to Caspian fight his way to sleep. Some nights it took 30 minutes, some nights it took 2 hours, but he always slept, and each night the sleep came faster. She learned the rhythms of him, the way he paced before bed, his footsteps marking a precise path between the window and the hearth, the way he sometimes spoke aloud while reading reports, muttering counter-arguments to himself like he was preparing for a debate that would never come. The way his voice dropped to barely a whisper when he was tired, the hard consonants softening until his words blurred together at the edges. She learned the sound of his nightmares. They came most nights around the 3rd hour, a sudden rigidity in his breathing, then silence, then a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a growl, something between the two, raw and guttural and full of a grief she did not understand. They never lasted long. Whatever pulled him under released him quickly, and his breathing would stutter back to normal, and he would sleep again. She never told anyone about the nightmares. On the 9th night, the curtain moved. Seraphine froze, her eyes snapping open in the dark. A shadow stood at the edge of her alcove, broad-shouldered and impossibly still. I know you are here. Caspian's voice was low, rough with sleep, stripped of every layer of authority and control she had ever heard him wear. I have known since the 2nd night. Seraphine sat up slowly, her heart hammering. Your Majesty, I can explain. Corvin told me everything. A pause. He also told me I have been sleeping. Yes. Another pause, longer this time. She could not see his face in the dark, could only sense the weight of him standing there, the warmth radiating off his body. Why does it work? He asked. There was no command in his voice, no authority, just exhaustion and something underneath it that sounded almost like wonder. I do not know, Seraphine whispered. He was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep standing up. Then he said, The alcove is too cold. There is a daybed by the hearth. You will sleep there from now on. Before she could respond, he turned and walked back to his bed. The mattress creaked. Within minutes, his breathing evened out. Seraphine moved to the daybed with shaking hands and found it already made up. Fresh sheets, a thick wool blanket, a pillow that was softer than anything she had ever owned. He had known she was there. He had known, and he had prepared a bed for her, and he had said nothing for 7 nights while she lay behind a curtain thinking she was invisible. She pressed her face into the pillow and breathed in the scent of cedar and something warm and alive that she was beginning to realize was simply him. For the first time since the arrangement began, Seraphine fell asleep before the king did. Weeks bled into weeks, and the arrangement became something neither of them named. Seraphine arrived each evening after the palace quieted. She slept on the daybed by the hearth. The king slept in his bed. They did not speak much, and when they did, it was about nothing important, which somehow made it feel more important than anything. "You burn through candles at an alarming rate," she told him one evening, watching him read by the light of 4 tapers that had been fresh that morning and were now guttering stubs. "I read at an alarming rate," he replied without looking up. "You could ask for oil lamps. Oil lamps smell. You could open the curtains and read by moonlight." He glanced up then, one eyebrow raised, and the look he gave her was so unexpectedly human, so dryly amused, that she felt something shift in her chest. Like a door she had not known existed had cracked open, just enough to let warmth in. She learned things about him that no one else knew. He hated the taste of mint, but drank mint tea every evening because his mother had liked it. He read military strategy before bed the way other people read poetry, for comfort, for familiarity, for the sound of ordered thought in a disordered mind. He had a scar on his left hand from a hunting accident when he was 12, and he flexed it unconsciously when he was stressed, opening and closing his fist around the old wound. He never asked her anything personal, not at first. She told him anyway, because the dark made her brave and the silence made her honest. "I was left on the castle steps," she said one night, staring at the ceiling while the fire popped and hissed. "Wrapped in a flour sack. Mistress Isolde said I was not even crying. Just quiet, like I already knew the world had no particular use for me." The silence that followed was different from his usual silence. Heavier, more present. "Isolde raised you?" he asked eventually. "She taught me herbs. She gave me a trade and a bed and a reason to be useful. She is the closest thing to a mother I have ever had." Another silence. Then, very quietly, almost too quietly to hear. "My mother died when I was 9. I still reach for her hand in the dark sometimes." Seraphine turned her head toward his voice. She could not see him, but she could feel the shape of that confession in the air between them, fragile and exposed and not meant for daylight. "What was her name?" she asked softly. "Isabel." He said nothing else, and she did not push. But something had shifted between them. An unspoken agreement that this space, this dark room with its dying fire and its 2 mismatched occupants, was a place where armor could be set down. The change in him was visible to everyone. Corvin reported that the king's focus had sharpened, his stamina returned, his temper steadied. The court noticed the color returning to his face, the bruised hollows beneath his eyes filling in, the coiled energy replacing the brittle exhaustion that had been consuming him. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew about Seraphine. Until Lady Oriel Thornwood arrived at court. The Thornwood delegation rode through the eastern gate on a Tuesday morning, 40 riders strong, their banners the deep burgundy and silver of the most powerful noble house on the northern border. And at the center of the column, mounted on a gray mare that matched her eyes, was Lady Oriel herself. Seraphine watched the arrival from the stillroom window. She had no reason to watch, no stake in the politics of border alliances and strategic marriages. But the entire castle had been buzzing about the Thornwood heiress for weeks, and curiosity was a weakness Seraphine had never learned to master. Lady Oriel was beautiful. Not beautiful in the way that court painters flattered their subjects into being, but genuinely, arrestingly beautiful. Dark auburn hair, a jawline that could cut glass. She dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had been born knowing exactly where she belonged. That is the woman who will be queen, Seraphine said to herself, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth. The betrothal had been arranged months before Seraphine had ever set foot in the king's chambers. It was political, strategic, the kind of alliance that held kingdoms together. Seraphine had always known about it. She had simply never had to see it walking through the gates on a gray horse, looking like it had been designed by the gods specifically to remind her of her place. That evening, she arrived at the king's chambers to find him already there, which was unusual. He normally came in after her, arriving late from council meetings or strategy sessions. But tonight he was seated by the window, staring out at the darkening sky, and he did not turn when she entered. "You saw the Thornwood arrival," he said. It was not a question. Seraphine set her things down and began preparing the daybed. "The whole castle saw it, Your Majesty. The bonding ceremony will take place next month." His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man delivering information he had rehearsed. "It is a political necessity. You understand?" "I understand perfectly," Seraphine said, and she was proud of how steady her voice sounded, how calm, how unmistakably the voice of a woman who understood her role. She could feel something through the bond, a low, unsettled hum like a string pulled too tight, vibrating on the edge of snapping. She had been feeling it for weeks now, this connection that had no name and no explanation, a warmth beneath her ribs that flared when he was near and ached when he was not. She had not spoken of it, neither had he, but it lived between them like a third presence in the room, growing louder by the day. Seraphine. The way he said her name made her hands still on the blanket, softer than he said it in public, like it cost him something. She looked up. He was watching her from across the room, his gray eyes unreadable, and for a single, suspended moment, she thought he was going to say something real, something that would crack the careful arrangement wide open and force them both to look at what was growing in the space between them. Instead, he said, "The arrangement will continue, regardless." Regardless. Meaning, regardless of the woman he was about to marry, regardless of the political alliance and the bonding ceremony and the queen who would sleep in the bed that Seraphine had spent months learning the creaking rhythms of. The arrangement would continue because she was useful, because she served a function, because she was convenient. "Of course, Your Majesty," she said. That night, Seraphine did not fall asleep before the king. She lay on the daybed with her eyes open and her chest aching and listened to him breathe, and she thought about Lady Oriel's perfect face and her perfect posture and her perfect claim to a man who had never once been Seraphine's to claim. Somewhere deep inside her, her wolf stirred. It pressed forward against her ribs, restless and agitated, and it whispered one word that Seraphine was not ready to hear. Mine. Lady Oriel Thornwood was not what Seraphine had expected. She had braced herself for coldness. Instead, Oriel was warm, disarmingly so, moving through the court with effortless charm that made everyone feel like the most important person in the room. Seraphine hated that she could not hate her. The first week of Oriel's residence passed in a blur of banquets and formal introductions. Seraphine observed it all from the periphery, the way she had observed everything her entire life. She watched Caspian with Oriel during a reception in the Great Hall. He was courteous, attentive, performing the role of devoted betrothed with practiced ease. He pulled out her chair. He leaned close when she spoke. He laughed at something she said, and the sound of it punched a hole through Seraphine's sternum because it was the same laugh he used in the dark with her, the real one, the one that came from somewhere unguarded. Or maybe it was not the same. Maybe she had been fooling herself into thinking she had access to a version of him that no one else did. That evening, Seraphine arrived at his chambers later than usual. She had taken the long route through the servants' corridors, telling herself it was to avoid the Thornwood guards who had been posted along the main halls, telling herself it had nothing to do with the knot in her stomach that tightened with every step closer to his door. Caspian was already in bed when she entered. He lay on his back with one arm behind his head, staring at the ceiling, and he did not look at her when she crossed to the daybed. "You were late," he said. "I was finishing a tincture." "You are a poor liar, Seraphine." She said nothing. She unfolded her blanket and smoothed it across the daybed with careful, deliberate movements, and she did not trust herself to speak because the ache beneath her ribs was so acute it felt like a physical wound. The bond hummed between them. She could feel it now with agonizing clarity, a taut thread connecting her chest to his, vibrating with every breath he took. It had been growing for weeks, deepening without permission, burrowing into the marrow of her. She had tried to ignore it. She had tried to reason it away. But there was no reasoning with something that lived in her blood. "Lady Oriel seems kind," Seraphine offered into the silence, because she was apparently a masochist. "She is," Caspian said, his voice carefully neutral. "And beautiful." "Yes. The court approves of the match." "They do." Seraphine nodded in the dark, her throat tight, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. "Good," she managed. "That is good." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Then Caspian said very quietly, "It does not feel good." Seraphine closed her eyes. She should not have heard that. He should not have said it. But the words hung between them in the dark, true and devastating and impossible to take back. She did not respond. Neither did he. Eventually, his breathing deepened and his body surrendered to sleep, and Seraphine lay on the daybed with tears sliding silently into her borrowed pillow and wondered how she had allowed herself to fall in love with a man who belonged to someone else. In the morning, he was gone before she woke. He had left a sprig of dried lavender on the table beside her bed. She held it in her palm and stared at it until her vision blurred. Then she tucked it inside her journal and went to work. The next 3 weeks were an exercise in controlled agony. By day, Seraphine watched the bonding preparations unfold with the grim resignation of someone watching a storm approach. Dressmakers arrived. A jeweler from the capital spent 2 days measuring Oriel's fingers. The great hall was being draped in burgundy and silver, the thornwood colors swallowing the room like a slow tide. By night, she slept 15 feet from a man who was about to pledge himself to another woman, and the bond between them screamed. It screamed in the way her hands trembled when she heard his voice. It screamed in the way his gaze lingered on her a beat too long when she entered the room. It screamed in the way his nightmares returned. Worse now, more violent, dragging sounds from his throat that made her dig her nails into her palms to keep from going to him. On the 14th night, she broke. His nightmare was bad, worse than anything she had heard before. He was thrashing, the bed frame groaning under his weight, and the sounds coming from him were not human. They were wolf sounds, raw and anguished, the cries of an animal in a trap. Seraphine was on her feet before she made the conscious decision to move. She crossed the room in 4 strides and reached for his shoulder. The moment her hand made contact, his own hand shot up and seized her wrist. His eyes flew open, wild, unfocused, the pupils blown wide. For a terrifying second, he did not know her. Then recognition flooded in. His grip on her wrist loosened but did not release. "Seraphine," he breathed, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer and an apology at once. "You were having a nightmare," she whispered. His chest was heaving, slick with sweat, his heart hammering so hard she could see the pulse jumping in his throat. His hand was still wrapped around her wrist, his thumb resting against her pulse point, and she knew he could feel how fast her own heart was racing. "Stay," he said. The word came out raw, stripped of every defense, not a command, a plea. Seraphine knew she should not. She knew that climbing into the king's bed while his betrothed slept 2 floors above them was a line she could never uncross. She knew that every rational thought in her head was screaming at her to step back, to return to the daybed, to remember her place. She climbed in beside him. His arms closed around her immediately, pulling her against his chest with a desperation that stole her breath. He buried his face in her hair and inhaled like he was drowning and she was air. His body was trembling, fine tremors running through his shoulders and arms, and she held him the way you hold something breaking, carefully, completely, with everything she had. "I have you," she whispered against his collarbone. "I have you." He fell asleep within minutes, his arms locked around her, his face pressed into the curve of her neck. And Seraphine lay there in the dark, wrapped in the warmth of a man she could not keep, and felt the bond settle between them like molten gold poured into a mold. Permanent, irreversible. When she woke, he was gone again. But this time, there was no lavender on the table. There was nothing at all, and the absence felt deliberate, like a door being closed. She did not see him for 3 days. The distance was intentional. Seraphine felt it like a blade drawn slowly across skin, not deep enough to kill, just deep enough to make every movement hurt. Caspian avoided her completely. He changed the time of his council meetings so she would not encounter him in the corridors. He sent Corvin to relay messages that had previously required her presence. He took his meals in his study instead of the Great Hall, and on the 2 occasions when their paths nearly crossed, he turned and walked the other direction with the rigid posture of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. The nights were worse. She still slept in his chambers. Corvin had insisted the arrangement continue because the king's sleep was too critical to the kingdom's stability, and Seraphine had not been given the authority to refuse. But Caspian no longer came to bed until long after she had fallen asleep, and he rose before dawn, and the space between the daybed and his bed stretched wider than any room had a right to feel. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her. And the bond between them, that golden thread she had felt settling into permanence, pulled tighter with every passing hour until Seraphine felt like she was being slowly torn apart from the inside. Her body began to betray her. Headaches pressed behind her eyes from the moment she woke. Nausea rolled through her at odd moments. A bone-deep chill settled in that no fire could touch, as though the warmth she had been drawing from his proximity was being deliberately withdrawn. Mistress Isolde noticed before anyone else. "You look like death warmed over a low flame," the old healer said. "When did you last eat a full meal?" "Yesterday," Seraphine lied. "Try again." "2 days ago." Isolde pulled up a stool and sat directly in front of her. "Tell me what is happening with the king." "Nothing is happening with the king." "Child, I have known you since you were small enough to fit inside a flour sack. Do not lie to my face." Seraphine's composure cracked. Not all at once, but in pieces, like ice giving way under weight. She told Isolde about the bond, about the nightmares and the night she had climbed into his bed, and the way he had held her like she was the only solid thing in a dissolving world. About Lady Oriel and the bonding ceremony and the terrible, consuming certainty that she was in love with a man who had chosen duty over whatever it was that lived between them. Isolde listened without interrupting. When Seraphine finished, the old healer was quiet for a long time. "You share a true bond," Isolde said finally. "Not a passing attraction, not proximity fondness, a true mate bond." Seraphine shook her head. "That is not possible. I am no one. I have no bloodline, no wolf lineage worth speaking of. True bonds form between equals." "True bonds form where they will," Isolde corrected firmly. "The moon does not consult a registry before choosing mates." She paused, her expression grave. "But a true bond that is denied, actively resisted by one or both parties, is not a gentle thing. It will tear you apart, Seraphine, both of you." He is getting married, Seraphine whispered. Then he is making a catastrophic mistake, Isolde replied. The banquet for the Thornwood delegation was held on a Thursday evening, 14 days before the bonding ceremony. Seraphine was not invited. She was not important enough to be invited. But Isolde had been asked to attend in case any of the elderly lords required medical attention during the 6-course meal, and she had brought Seraphine along as her assistant. Seraphine stood against the wall with a tray of tincture bottles and tried to be invisible. She was practiced at invisibility. She had spent 23 years perfecting it. But tonight, her body fought her at every turn. Her hands shook. Her vision swam at the edges. The bond was a living wire in her chest, vibrating with the proximity of the man seated at the head of the high table, the man who had not looked at her in 3 days, the man who was currently leaning toward Lady Oriel and smiling. Lord Hargreave, seated 3 chairs to the king's left, raised his goblet. Your Majesty, the court is eager. Will you share a word about your bride-to-be? The hall quieted. Oriel looked at Caspian with a polished, expectant smile. Caspian set down his goblet and surveyed the room with the easy confidence of a man born to hold attention. His gaze swept past Seraphine without pausing, through her, like she was glass. Lady Oriel is everything a queen should be, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Graceful, intelligent, devoted to her people. This alliance will strengthen Velthorn for generations. Polite applause rippled through the hall. Oriel inclined her head with practiced grace. Then Lord Hargreave, who had been drinking more freely than diplomacy advised, leaned forward with a grin that carried too many teeth. And the foundling girl? The herbalist? The court is curious, Your Majesty. You keep her awfully close for a servant. The hall went still. Seraphine's fingers tightened around the tincture tray. She watched Caspian's face, watched the micro-expressions flicker across his features. Calculation, warning, something desperate and trapped beneath the surface. And she waited. He smiled. It was the worst smile she had ever seen. Warm, easy, dismissive. The smile of a man who had nothing to hide because there was nothing worth hiding. Seraphine? He said, and the casualness with which he spoke her name sent a crack through something vital in her chest. She is only convenient, Hargreave. Surely you have noticed. The girl has a calming effect. My physicians confirmed it months ago. She helps me sleep. Nothing more. The tincture tray hit the floor. Glass shattered. Brown liquid spread across the stone in a widening stain, and every head in the hall turned toward the sound. Seraphine stood frozen, her empty hands at her sides, her face white. The silence was absolute. Then she knelt. She knelt on the stone floor in front of 300 people and began picking up broken glass with her bare hands, because that was what a convenient woman did. She cleaned up the mess, and she did not look up, and she did not cry. A shard bit into her palm. She barely felt it. She felt Caspian's gaze on her like a brand. She felt the bond between them flare with something violent and desperate, a surge of anguish that was not hers, and she ignored it. She gathered the broken glass and the ruined tinctures, and she stood, and she walked out of the banquet hall without looking at anyone. Behind her, she heard Oriel's voice, smooth and unbothered, redirecting the conversation to the wine selection, and the hall exhaled and moved on. Nobody followed Seraphine. She made it to the kitchens before her legs gave out. She sank to the floor beside the bread ovens, still warm from the evening bake, and she pressed her cut hand against her chest and she let herself break. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet, thorough shattering that happened entirely on the inside. Convenient. He had looked at 300 people and told them she was nothing. She sat on the kitchen floor until her breathing steadied and the tears dried on her face. Then she stood. She washed her hand. She wrapped it in a clean cloth. And she walked to her quarters and packed her bag. Fennec Ashgrove had first spoken to Seraphine 6 weeks earlier, at a trade summit where she had been tending to a burn on one of his advisors. He had approached not for treatment, but to return a dropped herb pouch she had not realized she had lost. "A healer without herbs is just someone with opinions," he had said, holding the pouch out with an easy half-smile. She had laughed despite herself, and something about the sound made his expression soften. After that, he found reasons to be near her. Not aggressively, not with calculated maneuvering. He asked about her work. He remembered the answers. He once brought her a cutting of moon petal from the gray mist lowlands because she had mentioned she had never seen one growing wild. "Why are you being kind to me?" she had asked him once. "Because you seem like someone who does not hear kindness often enough," he replied. She still did not know what to do with that. Now, standing at the tree line with her single bag and the wreckage of her heart, she looked at Fennec Ashgrove and felt the first full breath she had taken in weeks. "I cannot go back," she said. "I know. I have nowhere to go." "That is not true," Fennec said. "You have a standing invitation to Grey Mist. You have had one since the summit." He paused, studying her face with that quiet, patient attention she was beginning to recognize as simply who he was. "No conditions, Seraphine, no arrangements, just a safe place to land." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and followed him into the dark. They rode through the night. Fennec had brought a second horse, a sturdy bay mare with a calm temperament that matched the steadiness of the man who led her. The forest was thick around them, the moonlight cutting through the canopy in pale shafts, and Seraphine focused on the rhythm of the horse beneath her and the sound of hooves on soft earth, and nothing else. By dawn, the bond was a scream. She had not expected that. She had thought distance would dull it, dampen the vibration, provide some relief. Instead, every mile between her and Caspian stretched the thread tighter until it felt like a fishhook buried in her sternum, pulling backward, pulling her back. Her hands began to shake, her vision tunneled. She gripped the reins until her knuckles went white and focused on breathing. Just breathing, because if she stopped focusing on breathing, she would turn the horse around and ride back to a man who had called her nothing in front of everyone. Fennec noticed. Of course he noticed. He brought his horse alongside hers without a word and rode close enough that their stirrups nearly touched. A silent, solid presence that asked nothing and offered everything. "It hurts," she said through gritted teeth, and she was not sure if she meant the bond or the betrayal, or the 2 years of making herself small enough to fit inside someone else's convenience. "I know," Fennec said. Just that. No advice, no platitudes, no attempts to fix what was breaking. They reached the gray mist border by mid-morning. The territory was different from Valethorn, softer somehow, the forests deeper, the rivers slower, the light filtering through the trees with a greenish gold quality that made everything look like it existed slightly outside of time. Fennec's people met them at the river crossing. They were different too. No rigid formality, no elaborate hierarchy. A woman with calloused hands and a broad smile took Seraphine's horse. A young man offered her bread and cheese without asking who she was, or why she looked like she had not slept in a month. "You are safe here," Fennec told her as they dismounted. "Rest, eat. When you are ready, we will talk. And if you are never ready, that is also fine." Seraphine looked at him. This man who owed her nothing and offered her everything, and felt something crack open in her chest that was not the bond. It was older than the bond. Older than Caspian. It was the part of her that had been left on castle steps in a flour sack, the part that had spent 23 years believing she was only worth what she could give. "Thank you," she said, and her voice broke on the second word. Fennec's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. "You do not need to earn your place here, Seraphine," he said quietly. "You just need to be here. That is enough." She barely made it to the room they gave her before she collapsed. Not from the bond, though it was a relentless agony, but from the sheer exhaustion of holding herself together for so long. She fell onto the bed and slept for 14 hours. She dreamed of fog, thick, suffocating gray that pressed against her skin and filled her lungs. She stood in a clearing she had never seen before, surrounded by trees that were too tall, too skeletal, their branches reaching like fingers against a white sky. And across the clearing, on his knees in the soft, wrong ground, was Caspian. He looked destroyed. The composure, the authority, the carefully constructed armor of kingship, all of it was gone. What remained was a man on his knees in a dead place, and when he looked up and saw her, the expression on his face was so utterly shattered that it woke her with a gasp. Seraphine sat up in the unfamiliar bed, her heart slamming against her ribs, sweat cooling on her skin. The bond pulsed once, hard, a desperate, drowning throb that resonated through her entire body. He was not sleeping. Without her, he could not sleep. And wherever that foggy place was, he was trapped in it again, alone, with no one to pull him out. She pressed her fist against her chest and willed the ache to stop. It did not stop. It would not stop. And somewhere across the miles between Grey Mist and Veilthorn, the Alpha King who had called her convenient was drowning in a place no one else could reach. The messenger arrived at Grey Mist 3 days later, riding a horse so lathered it could barely stand. Fennec intercepted him at the gate. Seraphine watched from the window of the room they had given her, a small, warm space with lavender drying in bunches from the rafters, and a view of the river that caught the morning light in a way that made everything look gentle. She could not enjoy any of it. The bond had not eased. If anything, it had worsened, a constant gnawing ache that sat behind her ribs and pulsed in time with a heartbeat that was not hers. She had not slept properly since the first night. Every time she closed her eyes, the fog found her. And in the fog, Caspian was always there, always on his knees, always alone, and every night he looked worse. Fennec came to her door an hour after the messenger arrived. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told her the news was not good. "He is not well," Fennec said. No preamble, no softening. "Define not well," Seraphine replied, though she already knew. She could feel it through the bond, a darkness spreading like ink through water. His beta sent the rider. "The king has not slept since you left. 4 days now. His wolf is destabilizing. Corvin says he is losing coherence, alternating between rage and something worse than rage." Fennec paused. "He has called off the bonding ceremony." Seraphine stared at him. "What?" "Sent Lady Oriel home yesterday. Dismissed the Thornwood delegation. The Northern Alliance is effectively dead." Fennec's voice was quiet, factual, the voice of a man who understood the political devastation of what he was describing and was choosing not to editorialize. "Corvin says the king tore the betrothal contract in half in front of the full council and told them the marriage was a lie he could no longer sustain." Seraphine pressed her hand against her sternum. The bond flared, hot and desperate, and she tasted copper at the back of her throat. "There is more," Fennec said. He hesitated, and the hesitation frightened her more than anything else, because Fennec Ashgrove was not a man who hesitated. "Corvin's message says the king has been calling your name, not consciously. In the episodes, when his wolf surfaces, he calls for you, and when you do not come, it gets worse." Seraphine sat down on the edge of the bed because her legs would no longer hold her. "I have to go back," she said. Fennec did not argue. He did not try to convince her to stay. He did not remind her that the man she was racing back to had humiliated her in front of 300 people and called her convenient. He simply nodded and said, "I will ride with you." "You do not have to do that." "I know." He pushed off the doorframe. "I will have the horses ready within the hour." They rode hard through the day and into the evening. Fennec set a brutal pace, reading the terrain with the instinct of a man who had spent his life in these forests. As the shadows lengthened into dusk, Fennec slowed his horse and looked at her. When you reach him, you will want to be angry. You will have every right to be angry. Hold on to that. But do not let it be the only thing you carry into that room. He paused. He does not deserve your forgiveness yet, but he does deserve the chance to earn it. Seraphine looked at him and felt something she had no name for. Not the bond. Something older. Gratitude so deep it felt like grief. Fennec, she started. Go save your king, he said, with a half-smile that did not quite reach his eyes. I will be here if you need me. I will always be here. They reached Valethorn at midnight. The castle was wrong. A heaviness hung in the air, a charge like the atmosphere before a storm. Guards stood rigid at every post, their faces tight. The corridors were empty, the torches burned low. Corvin met her at the entrance to the king's wing. He looked like he had aged 5 years in 4 days. When he saw Seraphine, the relief that broke across his face bordered on collapse. Thank the gods, he breathed. He is in his chambers. He has not let anyone inside in 2 days. Seraphine walked past him without stopping, the bond pulling her forward like a rope around her ribs. The door was locked. She knocked. Leave, came the voice from inside, and it did not sound like Caspian. It sounded like something wearing his voice, something raw and hollowed out and barely holding shape. It is me, Seraphine said. Silence. A silence so complete she could hear the blood rushing in her own ears. Then the lock turned. The room was destroyed. Furniture overturned. Maps torn from the walls. The window glass cracked where something had been thrown against it. And in the center of the wreckage, standing barefoot in broken glass, was Caspian. He looked like death. The real kind. The kind that hollows out cheeks and darkens eyes. He was shaking, fine tremors running through his entire body, and his eyes were wild, flickering between gray and the amber gold of his wolf. You came back, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. You are standing in broken glass, Seraphine said. He looked down at his feet as though just noticing. The stone beneath his feet was marked where the glass had cut him. He did not seem to feel it. Seraphine crossed the room. She stepped over the broken chair and the shattered inkwell and the torn maps, and she stopped directly in front of him, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his skin, close enough to see the way his pupils contracted when he focused on her face. You called me convenient, she said, and her voice was steady and clear, and carried the weight of every tear she had cried on a kitchen floor. In front of 300 people, you reduced everything I am to a function. You made me feel like I was nothing, like I have always been nothing. Caspian flinched like she had struck him. Seraphine, I was trying to protect you. From what? From me. His voice broke. From being bound to a cursed king who cannot sleep, who cannot rule properly, who drags everyone he touches into the dark with him. You deserve more than that. You deserve more than being the woman who keeps the broken king alive. That was never your decision to make, Seraphine said, and the tears came now, hot and furious. You do not get to decide what I deserve. You do not get to break my heart to save me from a life I chose. I know, he whispered. You humiliated me. I know. You lied to your entire court. Yes. You let them think I was nothing to you. Caspian's face crumpled, not the controlled grief of a king managing his emotions, the raw, ugly, uncontainable breaking of a man who had run out of walls to hide behind. You were never nothing. The words came out ragged, torn from somewhere deep. You were everything. You are everything. And I was so afraid of destroying you that I destroyed us instead. And I am sorry. I am so sorry, Seraphine. I will spend the rest of my life being sorry if you let me. She hit his chest with an open palm. Once, twice, 3 times, the way grief hits when it has nowhere else to go. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. He stood there and took every blow like he had been waiting for them. Then she kissed him. She grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands and pulled him down to her, and kissed him with every ounce of fury and grief and desperate, aching love that had been building inside her for months. He responded immediately, his hands coming up to cradle her face, and he kissed her back with the hunger of a man who had been starving and had finally been offered something real. "I am still angry with you," she whispered against his mouth. "I know," he breathed. "This does not fix it. I know. But I am not leaving again." His arms closed around her, pulling her against his chest, and she felt the bond ignite between them, not the quiet hum she had grown accustomed to, but a roar, golden and fierce and absolute. He buried his face in her hair and inhaled, and the sound he made was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, but something between the two that held more truth than any words he had ever spoken. She pressed her lips to the place where his neck met his shoulder, the claiming mark, and the bond sealed with a force that stole the air from her lungs. Instinct. Pure, undeniable instinct. He mirrored the mark against her throat, and the connection that had been a thread became a river, became an ocean, became something too vast to contain. They sank to the floor together, wrapped around each other in the wreckage of his room, and for the first time in 5 days, the Alpha King of Velthorn closed his eyes and slept. Seraphine held him on the cold stone floor, his head in her lap, his weight against her, and she ran her fingers through his hair and watched the tension drain from his face. Not a king, not an alpha, just a man, sleeping in the arms of the woman who had chosen him despite everything. She stayed awake through the night, guarding his rest the way she always had, and when dawn crept through the cracked window, she was still there. The curse did not break cleanly. There were still nights when the fog came for him. Nights when Seraphine woke to find his body rigid beside her, his fists clenched, his breathing shallow and sharp. On those nights, she pressed closer, wrapped herself around him, and whispered him back. Sometimes it took minutes, sometimes it took hours, but she always reached him, and he always came back. The cord adjusted slowly, the way courts always do. A foundling herbalist as the Alpha Queen was not what anyone had envisioned. The whispers followed her through every corridor and every banquet hall for months. But Caspian stood beside her at every public appearance with a possessiveness that dared anyone to speak their objections aloud. And one by one, the whispers died. Fennec Ashgrove remained an ally. The political damage of the broken Thornwood alliance took months to repair, but Fennec brokered a new Northern compact that replaced what had been lost and strengthened what remained. He visited Valethorn twice a year, and he always brought moonpetal cuttings for the Queen's garden. Isolde wept at the wedding. Corvin did not weep, but his eyes were suspiciously bright, and he excused himself twice during the ceremony. On a morning 6 months after the bonding, Seraphine woke to pale light filtering through curtains that no longer needed to be drawn. Caspian was still asleep beside her, his face peaceful, one arm draped across her waist. No fog, no nightmares, no ghosts. She watched him breathe. This man who had broken her heart and then handed her the pieces and asked her to let him put them back together. It had not been easy. Forgiveness never was. But he had earned it in the slow, unglamorous way that real amends are made, not with grand gestures, but with daily, quiet, relentless devotion. She settled back against his chest, and his arm tightened around her in sleep, pulling her closer, holding her like she was the most important thing he had ever been trusted to keep. And she was. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you very soon for the next one.